Okay, everybody, so I have my bands that I made on the slab roller and cut. They are about 2 inches or so wide, and they're fairly thick, you know, they're 1/4 of an inch or more. And now I'm going to attach them to my pot, which I'll show you. I've been working on it a little bit, so I've got a couple layers already. And this is how I get them ready to attach. So I'm going to score them really well. And I use this serrated rib like the one that you have. And even if you have smaller pieces, that's okay. You can just kind of flatten them in a way that you sort of have a little bit of dimension coming out from the sides. And that just gives a little bit of clay to help connect. So I kind of have it in a shape that's almost like a little eye. I sort of push down. I get a little flap of clay there on the side. That's going to help me really attach it together. So I'm going to go through and flatten all of the strips here, and I will overlap them as I put them on so that I can work the clay together really well. I don't want it just to meet, but I actually want it to extend over the next piece of clay that I'm attaching. And this will take a few minutes. My piece is kind of large, so I'm going to probably do most of these here. And I just kind of really go through the whole thing. And then I'm also going to score the top of my pot so that it also has some teeth kind of marks to help grab the clay together. And then between the two layers of clay, I'm going to put a special slip that I'm going to make up for everybody called a stick-up slip. And it's a slip that has been made with a little bit less water and a little bit of flux that's going to help it kind of melt and strengthen that bond, help make sure that clay is going to stick together. All right, I'm just going to scratch all of these here, and I'll pause the video for the next step when I put the slip on and then attach it on. Okay. And then it was ready to accept some strips of clay. So I've got 2 layers on here so far, and I'm going to build kind of a large form. Maybe it'll be 30 inches tall or so. I don't expect you to build something that big, but the same construction methods that I'm going to use are going to apply for a smaller scale. So you may just want to make something that's 10 inches or 12 inches tall, or you may want to try something a little larger. So you can see I have my piece on a banding wheel here, and it's not quite symmetrical, it's a little bit off, but I actually kind of like the asymmetries of it, and sometimes there's a little bit of tension in the form and it causes it to warp a little bit in the firing, which I also sometimes kind of like. So now I'm going to score the top of, I'm going to put my slip down in here inside my bowl, score the top of my strips here on the bowl and really put a little bit of this stick-up slip on, and that's going to really kind of help it adhere. And I've got a little bit of extra clay. My clay that I'm going to attach is softer than the clay that I have here, and there'll be a little bit extra that I can help work down to make sure that I have a nice connection. Another technique that I often use in conjunction with the band building or coil building is paddling, and we're going to see a film of some ongi potters from Korea and also some Peruvian potters who use this technique to build large-scale vessels. It's often used in conjunction with paddling and throwing, or sometimes the coil and band building is just done by itself. So there's really a lot of options depending on the kind of surface treatment that you want for your form. One of the reasons that I like the paddling is it gives me a really smooth, stiff surface that has a kind of lovely sense of volume. I really like the kind of roundness that I can get with it. It feels almost like skin on the surface. All right, so put a little bit more of this stick-up slip all around. You can do it just with a little bit of water and adding a little slip, but hopefully this slip is going to help it adhere a little better. This is the first time I've used this slip, but it was a recipe that was recommended. It's the kind of slip that people who work with industrial ceramics tend to use, and they don't even score sometimes. So hopefully it'll make it a little better. So I'm grabbing some of my strips now. Now you can also angle the strips so that they go in the direction that you want them to. So if you want them to go out, you can sort of angle the edges so that the strips kind of lean out. I would like to have a little more volume with this form and then kind of come around. So I'm gonna just kind of put it down here, and then I'm gonna also stretch it. So after I attach them on here, sometimes once they've stiffened up for a little while, a couple hours or so, then I paddle them out a little bit to stretch the clay. So I want to make sure that my strips have enough thickness for me to be able to do that. And it helps me kind of integrate the layers. So I'm going to bring this around, and I got one here, so I'll probably end up having 3 or 4 little strips. All right, and then when one strip stops, I'm going to take it and I'm going to score the edge of it, the front face of it like this. All right, where the connections come together. And then I'll start the next strip in that place. So I'm going to score here on the inside edge of my strip. Now, one thing that's a little harder in the way that I'm constructing is that because they're so large, sometimes it's a little bit harder to control the attachment, but basically it's the same. You're going to add, oops, this angle is not quite right, so I want them to line up. I don't want it to overlap that much, so I'm going to kind of cut the same angle here on this clay, and then score the back side of it. So you need your clay to be stiff enough so that the connection is, so as I add the strips, I guess what I'm saying is I don't want them to be so floppy that they're going to not be able to stand up. All right, so I'm very careful to have a soft leather hard, but it's stiff enough, you know, it doesn't really bend in this little piece here. I don't know if that helps. It's something that you'll really probably have to touch. So when we're in the studio, you can feel what my clay is like, and I can give you some advice about whether to wait. Another way you can tell is if you start doing it and it starts to collapse, then you know you've gone too soon. But it's much more difficult at a larger scale than at a smaller scale. All right, so I'm kind of, let's see if I can bring this around so you can see. But I'm kind of pushing it together here. I've got a little bit of clay that I will go back with a rib and make sure that it's really well connected. I need some extra light there. I'm just going to keep bringing it around. And I'm a little thoughtful about, you know, the way it's going on here. I want it to really still come out a little bit. And I'll stretch it a little bit more with my paddle. But you can kind of control the way that these go on here. Let's see if this one's long enough. Not quite. I'm going to see. I think this one's longer than the other one that I have left, so I'm going to go ahead and try to connect these. This angle doesn't quite work, so I'm going to cut it off. And then I'll score that edge to put these together. All right. And the paddle will help me kind of even that out. You can also do a lot of scraping with your rib. That works really well to kind of bring it back down. Even the toothed edge of your rib, the scoring rib, is a nice tool sometimes for evening out the thicknesses of clay to make sure that the walls are going to shrink uniformly. All right, so I'm going to keep pushing this down. I push it inside and outside. Now I just added 2 strips in this last hour here, which might be a little much. It's starting to feel like it's going to move a little bit. But once I get this all connected here with this last little bit, and there's a complete circle, it will be much stronger and I won't have to worry about it coming apart so much. So let me again score these edges, make this one a little more even, score this one too, and make sure I have enough slip on there. So even the slip can make it slippery, so you actually do want to make sure it's connected and doesn't just get put adjacent. You really have to attach the edges. All right, so I've got too much clay here, I'm gonna cut some of that strip off, and then I'll wrap up those strips for another layer. So I want to keep my clay soft. So make sure you keep your strips or your bands, your coils covered on your boards with plastic underneath and plastic on top, and that will really make sure that they are not going to come apart. Okay, so now I'm going to take my rib and I'm just going to kind of work them through. Let's see if I can get this a little closer so you can see a little bit better here. But back here, maybe you can see how I have just a lot of extra clay. I'm just going to kind of work it together here. Sometimes I'll use a wooden rib. Let me grab one here because it tends to work it together nicely without actually removing any of the clay. So I want to keep that clay there because I want to, sometimes the metal ribs will scrape it in a way that it comes off, and I really want to keep all that clay on there to make sure that the connection is nice and solid. All right, and I'll take a little more time to carefully sort of work all that through. But just kind of go around on the inside usually first, just to make sure that my connection is nice and strong. And then it's kind of a big pot. I'll do it again on the outside. So starting here, work that together. And then this part where it's a little thicker, I'll just take a little more time later to even that out. And I'll probably go around with the paddle. Might do it gently while it's soft, and then when it's a little bit stiffer, I'll let it just dry like this. I'll just paddle it and thin it a little better. But the first thing I'm doing right now while the clay is soft is I'm making sure that the connections are solid and that I don't have any gaps or holes where the clay is not connected well. And this is going to make a big difference as it dries. If you let the clay dry when there's a hole and there's not a good smoothing of the seams, it may end up getting a crack that will grow in a way that you can't really control it later. So let's see, I'm going to just smooth this up a little. All right, and just kind of go around the whole thing. So the banding wheel is really nice. We have the nice blue banding wheels. Please don't leave them on your shelf. They need to stay in circulation, so they need to stay on that table so everyone can use them. Be sure to sanitize them when you're done. But you also we also have some thinner, not as quite as nice banding wheels that are silver, and they're up on the top of that pegboard, and they work really well when you have a heavy pot, like this pot would work fine on there. But it's nice to just be able to kind of push, move the pot around slowly, and it'll just sort of advance itself if you're working on something like this. If your pot is not round, you don't need to use a banding wheel, although it is important to remember to turn your sculpture so that you're really continuing to consider it in its 3 dimensions and not just like a painting where you're only looking at it from one direction, or it will feel kind of pictorial. So let me move the tripod back. Get out of the way, Finn. Finn is my dog, if you haven't seen him. He likes to hang out in that chair behind my workspace. All right, so, you know, it's a little wonky, but I think it kind of has a nice sense of volume. And I'll kind of mess with it as I paddle it out. I can kind of change the shape on it a little bit. So we are going to try some paddling. I'll have you guys make up some beginning forms on Monday, and then if we want to, we can paddle them out on Wednesday. But I have a rock here, and it's sort of flat and round and wide, and then I have a paddle. I have a bunch of paddles in the studio for you guys to use. This is a nicer paddle. It has a concave side and a flat side. So I'm just going to kind of go around and stretch it very gently and kind of work it together. It's a little easier sometimes to paddle it when it's stiffer rather than when it's softer. I find sometimes when you're a beginner that you can thin it too much, and you definitely don't want to do that. So it's a little more forgiving and easier to paddle when it's a little bit stiffer. If it's too stiff, it'll be hard to move it. But there's kind of a nice balance in between. So if you're interested in paddling or learning to paddle, I did post a video of a workshop that I gave in the introductions that we did before the class started. It's at the bottom of that introduction page there. But also, we'll make some small pieces that you can hold in your lap, and if you want to have just a small paddle bowl, you can do that. Okay? So I'm just going to kind of go around and around. You don't have to watch the whole thing if you know. And try to even up that seam. When it's really a little soft like this, it gets sticky. You'll see the Ongi potters use a paddle technique that's similar to this, and they use more water and throwing, but they also are not working quite this wide, and they have little heaters that they use to help dry their pieces. So this, I'm careful to kind of, I can keep it kind of even, it's nice. Just stretch it evenly. I don't want to stretch it too much. I still am looking for, you know, a little bit of thickness because I want it to be sturdy. I don't want it to collapse on me. Alright, so I think I'm going to let it stiffen up a little bit, and then I will add another piece. So I'll try to do some stopgap motion that you can see, or time lapse, right? So you can see it going more quickly without having to wait for the whole thing.